Hello, my name is Russ Timpson. I'm the founder of the Tall Building Fire Safety Network. What you're about to see is a video from our 2025 Tall Building Fire Safety Conference. You can find more other great videos on tall building fire safety on our YouTube channel, and there are many more presentations on our website, www.tallbuildingfiresafety. If you find our videos and presentations useful, please like and subscribe us on our YouTube channel. Halfway through the video, you're going to see details of our 2026 conference, which will take place in May in London. We have a fantastic program, and we also have a separate high-rise firefighting masterclass with Brent Brooks and special guests from around the world. There are also details of our 5-day intensive tall building fire safety management course, which will be running in London throughout 2026, but also in the Mediterranean, in Cyprus and in Malta. This is an ideal course for anybody who's dealing with fire safety matters in tall and complex buildings. So I hope you find these videos useful, and as we say in the Tall Building Fire Safety Network, go high and go well. Thanks.
I'm following those two very digital presentations. This is very analog.
Well, I mean, you've mentioned the golden thread, but I think just probably.
So we've heard about the golden thread and about competence from a regulatory perspective, but I'll give you a hairy builder's view of life. So once upon a time, I was a technical lead for a builder on covering a number of HRBs, and one of them is the Skypool that you're probably familiar with. As a technical lead on when you're building a building, my primary objective was to make sure that the information enabled us to build the building in accordance with the specification, on budget and on time. The closest you would get to legacy or a golden thread, back then would be the O&M manual or the home user guide. I remember once we had a contractual requirement to deliver the O&M manuals to the Housing Association in triplicate in hard copy. So you can imagine printing that out. It filled the entire boardroom with, boxes of paper, and the Housing Association came, they looked around the building, saw the paper, signed it off, and walked out and didn't even take it with them. So this is the legacy of information handling that we're dealing with. There's a lot of talk about the golden thread, and sometimes the phrase can get used on things that are not really what it was intended for. So just to be absolutely clear, what we're talking about is, what was introduced in the final Hackett report, in Section 88 of the Building Safety Act, the Keeping and Provision of Information Regulations, or the KPI information regulations, the Management of Safety Risk Regulations. In the KPI regs, the deliverables are split into information and documents. So to give you some examples of what they would be on an occupied building, information would be the name and address of the building, the key building information, the details of who the PAP is, for example, and then documents would be, for example, the safety case report. So from a client's perspective, we need to start thinking about the golden thread not as a legal requirement, but as an asset. Tools such as ISO 19650 and BS 8644 Part 1 can help us to specify a structure for that information that serves our purposes. If you had an existing building, so it's important not to just lurch from one legal requirement to the next, but to recognize that information as an asset, and let's get intentional about it. If you had an existing building, you weren't quite sure about the health of it, what would you do? You would do a dilapidation report. And it's exactly the same. You can do exactly the same thing with data. So, I use a crib sheet that allows me to basically go through the data and establish the health of that data. We can then use that information and feed it into our risk profiling system to establish, how much of a risk does this pose us. So back in 2022, this is exactly what I did across 132 HRBs in order to understand, exactly what was missing, what wasn't. Then you can work out, which are the most serious problems and which are the ones that we can deal with first. Once we've established, what needs to be dealt with, we can apply the Plan, Do, Check, Act system that you probably heard from before. So BS 9997 provides a structure for us to be able to, make a plan of what we're going to do. So the first stage of that is to work out who are the customers of that data. Who's this data actually going to be for? Once we've done that, we can then make a plan, and we can create actions to deal with that missing information. And then it's really important for us to check that those requirements have been met, and then we can act to address the shortfalls, or efficiencies, and just get better. And that cycle repeats and repeats. Unfortunately, bringing in, expensive consultants or some, flashy, all singing, all dancing system is just not the answer. This is about doing what we all knew we should have been doing the whole time and doing it right. So an example would be a common data environment. These systems have been around for decades, and we still haven't scratched the surface of their capabilities. And, jumping on to the next shiny piece of software or AI is not necessarily creating the cultural change that we require. The IMechE Building Safety webinar series has got a bit more detail on that, and you can access that on YouTube. The regulations don't specify what systems you can use. You can use any system. The one thing that is important, though, it does state that it should be a dedicated system. We have seen, and I've been involved in trials where we wanted to use, a SharePoint integrated system. Let's just say it didn't work. It's important to have a proper, structured, revision-controlled system that's managed. You'll be familiar with doing walk-rounds, client walk-rounds of buildings where you walk around and you work out where has the building got to and at what stages. But no one seems to do that with the data. How do you know that your data is at the right stage during construction? We need to start getting intentional about this. So when it comes to, for example, doing the building safety case, all of a sudden everyone's in a panic because they don't have the information. And then we plug a hole with an expensive consultant or some AI or something, but then when another requirement comes around, you just end up lurching from one requirement to the next. So one of our colleagues touched on a point earlier on about having to regurgitate information for different requirements, and I absolutely feel that pain. It's something that the industry has got to get way better at. Just getting a sudden demand from some housing association or some regulatory requirement or the local council or the fire brigade to regurgitate information in a format that's suitable for them is incredibly resource hungry. I myself have spent over £1 million in resources in the last year on people just purely regurgitating information that was already there, and we can avoid that. The approach that we take, rightly or wrongly, not saying that this is right, but this is what we've done to make it work. So we have a common data environment, so all of the golden thread information is in there. So for a typical building, we have maybe 15,000 documents, something like that. It's not particularly user-friendly, should we say, because there's a lot of information. But the information is useful. Like remember when we talked about the different customers of information earlier? We need to provide windows to the right information to the right people in a format that's useful to them. So what we can then do is pull out that information, and this is what we do. So we've got obviously the LFB's high-rise building portal. We can take the information out of the golden thread, put it in there. We've got information that goes in the premises information box, high-rise building registration. We've got our mandatory occurrence reporting system. We've got a separate system for managing complaints, but there's information that goes into there. And there's an app, so certain information goes into that so that the residents can interact with it as well. And then obviously if there's an update to the building, like, there's a fit out of a new yoga studio on the ground floor or something like that, that goes into the golden thread again. Or if we find some photographic records that previously weren't filed properly, we can put them in. And this, the uses are so big it doesn't even fit on one slide. So we can just keep augmenting that same thread with all of these different requirements, and more will come. Some of these links are automated. So with the fire door information, we've managed to get that automated and talking to the golden thread system. Some of them are painfully manual, but by having integrity in our data, it provides for us to add, automation later once the APIs get a bit more accessible and so on. One tool that we've found which is particularly useful. So I've got a new member of my team who's just helping us with the administration, and he said to me the other day, he goes, "Why is there 3 different drawings for the same thing?" And I was like, well, it's obvious. You've got one architect that worked up to stage 3, then you got a stage 4 architect, and then you had a contractor who installed that piece of aluminium rain screen, and he's got his drawing. And he said, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. So the contractor's drawing is going to be more accurate. And I was like, yeah. And he said, why does loads of it say by others on it? I said, well, those are other contractors. So there's a different one for the windows, and there's a different one for the brickwork, and so on. He was like, oh, okay, cool. So I need to go and look at their drawings. I was like, yeah, that's exactly what you need to do. Except for the bricklayers, because they didn't do drawings, so you need to go back to the architects. And he's like, oh, okay, I don't really quite follow. And to be fair, this is what we deal with, don't we? And we just know, but because we've been living and breathing it, but you actually look at it, it's ridiculous. And there's a rule on my projects, people will know, if you write by others on a drawing, you have to make a donation to the firefighters' charity. So it's just not acceptable. But to be fair, if you're a contractor, he's like, well, I don't know who's doing that, and I don't know what insulation that is or whatever. But what we do is we give a unique reference number to every material, so they can say, well, that's insulation number 1. And if it's not by him, that's fine. He still knows it's insulation number 1, and we've got a matrix that tells him exactly what it is. And that matrix gets initiated at the start of the project. And then anytime there's a change control process, and then the matrix gets updated. And we started to get a little bit clever with it and link it into the golden thread so the links are always up to date. So you can just click on anything and you can see what it is. So, you start at, that's the wall, the inside wall at that end, and this is the outside of the wall at this side. And you can click on the different bits of it, and you can always see, and you know that that's always right, basically. So that's the way that we've used to solve the problem. Not saying it's right, but it's the way we've done it, and it works for our purposes. And we've done the same thing for fire doors, but with the fire doors, what we do is we associate the information to the actual door itself using a QR code, and that talks to the golden thread system. So if there's if the guys are doing their quarterly checks and they find something that's not quite right, it comes up on our risk management system, and we can work out how serious an issue is it, and then we can prioritize it and, aggregate the remedial works together rather than just sending someone to do one door there and one door there. We can group them together and get them dealt with in a constructive and efficient manner. Coming back to our plan, do, check, act system, everything's not necessarily always going to be right. So it's important for us to do regular checks. And if our checks are not finding anything, then they're not very good checks. Unfortunately, in the industry, there can be, once we start doing things that improve, there's a bit of a sort of high-fiving scenario goes on and saying that everything's great. But we do need to focus on, how can we get better? So we need to take a mature view of identifying where things can be improved. And we keep using that plan, do, check, act cycle to keep getting better. Obviously, we can have all these clever systems, but unless we've got the integrity of the data, it's all just a complete waste of time. So one of the things that we do in our checks is just keep focusing on the integrity of the data. The number of I'm going to deliberately pick on fire alarm maintenance contractors because they've earned it. So the number of fire alarm maintenance records that I see that are just not adequate is completely ridiculous. And we have to keep telling them, that's not, yes, I've got it. That doesn't mean I'm compliant. Is it good enough? And I'm going to read it, and I make sure that the person who's responsible for signing off is competent and knows what it means. So so obviously getting the maintenance done in the first place is one thing, but making sure that it's to sufficient quality is the next thing. So going through that plan, do, check, act system, we can keep getting better. And once we've got that integrity of data, it starts to get really powerful. So we've started doing some trials with a system where we can use the output of our fire risk assessments, structural risk assessments, and the performance of the systems on our building, and we can aggregate that to provide us with a real-time risk profile. So I'm looking at my 132 HRBs. I can see which ones have an aggregated risk profile, and we can target interventions in an intelligent manner. But, we've started to do some really cool things, but it's really important that, there are certain companies in the industry, there's huge quantity of small businesses, and, they are doing work on our buildings, and we need to bring them along with us. And it's absolutely key that we, remember that every building has got numerous stakeholders, including the residents, the small maintenance contractors, and so on, and they need to come along on this journey with us. And I think we've seen a step change in attitude in the industry, especially around the golden thread, and people can see a meaningful way forwards. However, on the subject of competence, we're just not really at the party yet, in my view. I think, talking about skills, knowledge, and experience is one thing, but, if I was to present these standards to a contractor who's doing the entrance system for the gym, for example, they're interfering with the means of escape, it's a critical system. If I start talking about PAS 8672 to them, they're going to look like look at me like I'm a Viking or something. So we need to start breaking this down into sort of meaningful outputs. So what we've done is identified the key roles and responsibilities of the main contractor. This is obviously straight out of the regulations, but we've interpolated it into a sort of more user-friendly form. Skills, knowledge, and experience is very familiar to lots of people, and we can, we've been dealing with it for a long time. But the additional competencies for high-risk buildings are, more challenging to demonstrate, and then the behavioural competence is the tricky bit for most contractors. And to be honest, it was difficult for us initially as well to demonstrate that we have and display the right behaviours in the project. There's a kind of dichotomy in competence in that if you are not competent, then you probably don't have the competence to realise that you're not competent. And this unfortunately breeds, there are people in our industry who, have been cracking on for, this is the way I've done it for 30 years, and don't see the trail of wreckage that they've left behind. And, as, a builder who we, own the land, we design the building, we build the building, we operate the building, we write the theme tune, we sing the theme tune, It's our problem, basically. So there's no getting away from it. It has to be right. But trying to get so we have the culture, but trying to be able to interpret that and, bring that through our supply chain is really quite challenging. So we've gone on this journey, and, we had to work quite hard to create a positive environment that allows people the comfort to say, oh, I might have been, I've been maintaining sprinklers for 30 years and I actually don't understand how this works. We need to let people tell us where there's gaps and not just gloss over it, and then there's an unknown risk there. So the core criteria for competence apply to everyone. So no matter their function, these are the things that they absolutely have to be able to demonstrate. And the way we did this was we split everyone in the team on the project down into their functions. And we applied a risk profile to that function, which depends on the type of the building. Most of our buildings are quite complex. You've normally got, multiple uses. You might have a school or a theatre or whatever on the ground floor, and then numerous blocks of flats, and then multi-levels of basements, and maybe an automated parking system, and a cinema and a gym, and all this kind of stuff. So depending on the complexity, we need different competence levels. And then what we do is we apply a functional competence requirement. So it's basically like an organogram for the project, but we put the competence requirements against it. Then we look at the people that we've got in those roles and make sure that they match up. When I was a kid, I absolutely loved top trumps. Do you remember you had a card and it might have the McLaren F1 GTR was always the best one to have, and it had highest top speed and so on. So there's basically different parameters, and there would be a different score against each of those parameters. And that's basically what we've got for our team. So everyone's got their top trump card. They have to review it at least annually, and with their line manager, they're supported in terms of understanding where they need to get to, and given CPD and additional training and access to expert advice to get to where they need to be. So we then map those individual competencies against the requirements for the project. Where there's shortfalls, what we can do is apply mentoring, expert advice, and additional supervision to address those shortfalls. And then we've got to help people through the behavioural piece as well. And a lot of that's about building the culture and the safe space to enable people to do the things that, we know we should, but in the past maybe sometimes didn't. And, we've got to own that and deal with it, basically. Obviously, where there's shortfalls in the team, it's really important that we provide a safe space to bring the team along with us, and the supply chain as well. One of the things that's a little bit hazardous, actually, is that there's a lot of supply chain procurement schemes. So these procurement schemes, it's quite often assumed that they check competence. Everyone I've met doesn't. Every time I was introduced to them, the person who introduced me thought that they did. So that's a problem. So we need to get better at not only managing our own competence, but managing our supply chain competence. With our supply chain, we've got third-party accreditation systems, and that's always the best way of making sure that people are competent, working out what is the appropriate scheme that governs their discipline, and are they accredited to that level. And then for individuals, one of the things that's really starting to get the recognition that it requires is professional registration for the team. So if you've got chartered engineers on your team that are applicable, have charterships and skills, knowledge, experience and behaviour in the discipline that you're in, they can become really useful. And we can then also, the people that haven't got that but would like to do it, we can mentor them and help them get to that stage. So that concludes the discussion.
Thank you.